Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. This was in the neighborhood box. It says, black on both sides identifies multiple intersections between blackness and transness from the mid-19th century to present-day anti-black and anti-trans legislation and violence. Drawing on a deep and varied archive of materials, C. Riley Snorton attends to how slavery and the production of racialized gender provided the foundations for an understanding of gender as mutable. It sounds like a very interesting history, particularly for those who are interested in the theory side of things. I am very much an advocate of letting people live as they would like to live and be as they would like to be, identifying themselves as they would like to identify themselves. But I don't think that going into this much detail of the history is going to be right for me, so I am going to put it back. This was in the neighborhood box. I will put it back tomorrow. Alas, I have another book about which I must report the same thing, and that is this book by Adam Kirsch. Adam Kirsch is one of my favorite contemporary writers of literary criticism. He is also a poet. His poetry has never floated my boat, rung my bell, tooted my whistle, so to speak. But his criticism has always been very good, and actually 8 years ago, at the time, shortly after Donald Trump's winning the presidency, he had an article at Slate. I will put a link to it in the description box because I can't remember the title of it, but I want to just read you a little bit of it. For this, it's mostly one paragraph, maybe a little bit more. This little bit that he wrote puts him forever in my esteem. It was the kind of clear-headed forethought that seems to be so rare in our society. As a man who has devoted his life to thinking about what used to be called high culture, he begins, well, he does, I'm omitting a little bit. High culture has forfeited the power to define the individual's reality. The central role that writers and artists have played in public debate and popular culture is a thing of the past. But that role was always secondary to their real purpose, which is to create works that help readers and viewers to shape their lives. Art is supposed to be a tool for interpreting our experience and determining our values. And yet, such a statement can seem impossibly abstract and idealistic at a time when the nation itself is in danger. One of the definitions of a time of political crisis is that the public usurps the private. It becomes impossible to control what we think about, what dominates our minds and emotions. At such times, in the words of Bertolt Brecht's poem, To Those Who Come After, a conversation about trees is almost a crime. What are the arts to do? What are people involved with the arts to do in such a period? The first lesson we must learn is that it was our prior sense of normality that was the illusion, not our new sense of disaster. The world is always on fire, ... So particularly the sentence, one of the definitions of a time of political crisis is that the public usurps the private. It becomes impossible to control what we think about, what dominates our minds and emotions. That really impressed itself upon me 8 years ago when Donald Trump had just ascended to the presidency or was about to, and everybody was fearful of what that portended. So we are again at a similar juncture. I don't think we are so fearful at this time of Donald Trump, the man, but we still do not know what will happen with all of this motley crew of grifters and climbers with whom he has surrounded himself. But that's not what I care to talk about here. Some time ago, I got a book titled Palestine Hijacked. This author has another title which was very recommended, and I read somewhere that that book had been revised and now became Palestine Hijacked. I don't see any indication that this is a revising of that earlier book. I would rather see the earlier book, but it was only available from secondhand vendors for something like $1,000 per copy. So I went with the revised copy, if that's what it is. Regardless, it's newer, so it will have more information. And my idea was to read that at the same time as on settler colonialism. This is quite a hefty book, and I believe it is going to give a decent history. This, I was a bit disappointed when I saw it because it's not really even a book. It smacks of something that was rushed out solely to capitalize on a genocide. Now, I'm not going to impute that to Adam Kirsch. As I say, I've read his writings going way back, and so I have a good respect for the man. And I was very curious to hear what he had to say on settler colonialism. However, I am finding that, as with this book, it may be too academic to my tastes. It may be going into the weeds of what is taught at the university a little more than I would like. A while ago, I had a real popular video because I said something about how I was not going to read this book. I am relatively new at BookTube. I'm over a year now, but at the time I didn't realize if you phrase your title in a certain way, it becomes clickbait. And I had not intended that to happen. It was about why I was not going to read this book, simply because I don't care for this author's writing style. And it seemed noteworthy to me. If I can find it, I will put a link to it in the description box, but it's not anything that I'm urging you to go look at. That author was mentioned in here, and I thought I would just talk about this book a little bit. I've read a little bit, and I really don't think I'm going to read any more. So it's 130 pages with very little on a page. So it's more like a pamphlet. I wouldn't be surprised if this is skimpier than Common Sense or one of those things that were going around in revolutionary times. So both the preface and the first chapter begin almost in the same way. So I'll read you the first sentence from the preface. The crisis that began last October 7, when Hamas terrorists infiltrated Israel and killed some 1,200 people is still ongoing as of this writing 6 months later. So he says it was 6 months later. I can't believe it took anything like 6 months to write and to publish this book. I imagine it was done in something of a weekend, maybe a month ago. But I'm not privy to the ways of the publishing industry. Just because I can write and publish a book in a very short span of time does not mean that the lumbering, cumbersome publishing industry can do so. I think that this is published by Norton, and this is written by Snorton. So that's just a little tidbit for you. So that was the preface. It began talking about the crisis that began last October 7th. So the first chapter starts the theory of a massacre, and you will see it begins almost exactly the same way. Let me read a little bit of this for your edification. The Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, revealed a seismic change in the way young people in the United States think about Israel and Palestine. I will read more, but it's striking to me that we have more than a year of an ongoing genocide occurring in Palestine, and twice already he's wanted to bring up the event of this massacre. You know, I think we now talk about the invasion of Iraq, the Iraq War, and all of the harm or evil, if you will, that was wrought by the George W. Bush administration. We can talk about that now without every single time having to mention that it came upon the heels of the World Trade Center collapsing. And in fact, we know pretty clearly at this point that the World Trade Center towers coming down had nothing to do with the ensuing attack on Iraq, even though it was packaged that way. The attack on Iraq was something that had been thought about and talked about. It was in the works, so to speak, and the felling of the trade towers came as a convenient pretext. Unfortunately, there is evidence beginning to emerge that a similar situation may obtain with this genocide in Gaza, that forces in the Netanyahu government and elsewhere had been long intending to eradicate the Palestinians from their homeland and turn the land over to settler colonials. Okay? Let me continue with this. A poll conducted 2 months after the attack found that while Americans as a whole supported Israel over Hamas by 81% to 19%, those aged 18 to 24 were split 50-50. Within that age group, 66% of respondents agreed that Hamas's attack was, quote, genocidal in nature. Yet, 60% also said it can be justified by the grievances of the Palestinians. In other words, more than half of college-age Americans seem to believe that it would be justified for Palestinians to commit a genocide of Israeli Jews. I just want to point out that there is a bit of sleight of hand going there. The poll was a Harris poll, and There is no real way to look at the question which asked, was the Hamas attack genocidal in nature? That question was what we would call a leading question. So the answers given to that kind of question can't really be counted on for anything. If when the World Trade Center came down, or in the wake of its felling, somebody had posed a similar question to Americans, was the taking down of those towers genocidal in nature? People may have said yes. People may not have understood the terms with the way our college students are in the US these days, given 3 decades of dumbing down of primary school and whatnot. I would not rely on a poll like this, but it's curious that Kirsch relies upon a poll and then suggests that they believe genocide is justified against Israeli Jews. It's a real stretch to extrapolate that from those questions, at least as I infer them from what he has written here. I am not sure why. It should not need to be stated, but I will go and state it, that when those terrorists flew those planes into those towers, it was not an act of war. It was portrayed as an act of war. It was a criminal act. And to treat it as an act of war was a mistake, let's say. That's putting it kindly. It was a willful distortion. Similarly speaking, a massacre in which 1,000 some people were killed is not an act of genocide. Let me continue. The October 7 attack was perfectly calculated to crystallize this momentous shift in American opinion because it reversed the usual terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Since Hamas, an Islamist political movement, took power in the Gaza Strip in 2007, it has fought several brief but costly battles with Israel. Until 2023, these conflicts followed the same pattern. Hamas fired rockets at Israeli towns near the Gaza border, and Israel responded with artillery, shelling, and airstrikes. Each time, the disproportion in firepower meant that far more Palestinians were killed than Israelis, provoking criticism of Israel around the world. During Israel's Operation Cast Lead in December 2008, about 1,400 Palestinians were killed and 9 Israelis. During Operation Protective Edge in July and August 2014, about 2,100 Palestinians were killed and 72 Israelis. And in Operation Guardian of the Walls in May 2021, 232 Palestinians were killed and 8 Israelis. I have to say I'm not sure why he begins with Hamas in 2007, because throughout my adult life, whenever I have heard of these conflicts, it has invariably been a similar proportion count. So you would have seven Israelis were killed and 108 Palestinians, that sort of thing. But he starts it with Hamas. This pattern changed dramatically on October 7, when Hamas fighters infiltrated into Israel and indiscriminately killed some 1,200 people while taking more than 250 hostages. The attack killed 4 times as many Israelis in a single day as in the previous 15 years of conflict put together. But coming on a year after the fact of the events, and it's more than a year now because I am talking about this on the cusp of December 2024. So it's tomorrow will be Thanksgiving here in the U.S. If you tabulate the 1,200 people that Hamas killed on October 7 with the numbers that have been killed subsequent of Palestinians, you will see that the proportionality of the event has just continued. It does not represent any kind of a change in the status quo. It has just, to use John Mearsheimer's favorite phrase, it has just gone up the escalation ladder. It has just gotten quantifiably greater. But the disproportion is as it ever was. I would not doubt that the proportion, indeed, of Palestinians killed has risen, the ratio, if you will. So, right with that, I am inclined to put the book aside. I don't know. This purports to be a discussion about the theory of settler colonialism. And I am not an academic. I don't know how the theory is used. I'm not good with jargon. I find the phrase itself, settler colonialism, to be useful occasionally. I've never used it in anything that I've written, and I don't know if I've spoken it. It's possible I have. It's a convenient shorthand, as with so many other words that you will see me use in a video. I will say something is a great book. What do I mean by great? It's just a shorthand. So, I am not a scholar. I am not a student of settler colonialism or what have you. But it is interesting that he brings up historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, whose book I did not like. He talks about Martin Luther King Jr., and this little passage will be referred to. At the March on Washington, he compared the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to a promissory note that for Black Americans had never been paid. So there is a reference to that in this. So this talks about how somebody named Horace Callan, instead of using the metaphor of the melting pot, felt in his 1915 essay that America should embrace the ideal of multiplicity in unity, in which each ethnic group contributes to the greater good by maintaining its specific emotional and voluntary life. So then this is Kirsch going on. Instead of a melting pot, he wanted the United States to imagine itself as an orchestra in which every instrument's unique timbre contributes to the beauty of the symphony. But this metaphor presupposes that the orchestra has the right to exist in the first place. From the perspective of settler colonialism, Native Americans aren't just another, and this is a typo, aren't just another an instrument. I will elide the an, which doesn't fit. From the perspective of settler colonialism, which only adds to my suspicion that this book was rushed out post-haste more recently. Though, again, I want to clear myself of imputing that I think Adam Kirsch would want to capitalize upon a genocide, even though such a book is sure to sell like hotcakes. This metaphor presupposes that the orchestra has the right to exist in the first place. From the perspective of settler colonialism, Native Americans aren't just another instrument in the orchestra. They are more like the rightful owners of the land on which the concert hall stands. To do justice to them would mean putting the orchestra out of business. So he's talking about a theory of settler colonialism. So this is going way beyond my familiarity. So apparently the ideology of settler colonialism, which he is criticizing, is suggesting that everybody who came to this continent after the indigenous Americans must be put to death. That is what he is saying the theory declares. I've never heard that, but historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz offers a comprehensive statement of this anti-liberal position in her book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. So not the book that I mentioned. As the title indicates, Dunbar-Ortiz takes aim at an idea that might seem as anodyne as King's promissory note. The notion that America is a nation of immigrants, she writes, was introduced in a 1958 book by the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and embraced by President John F. Kennedy. For these mid-century liberals, the idea was meant to demolish any snobbish distinction between America's WASP elite and more recent arrivals from Ireland or Italy or Poland. The Puritans on the Mayflower were immigrants just like the huddled masses at Ellis Island. No group had a better claim to the title of American than any other. For Dunbar-Ortiz, however, the notion that America is a nation of immigrants is a myth invented for propaganda purposes during the Cold War. Faced with decolonization movements around the world and a Soviet rival that claimed to champion them, U.S. ruling classes created a revisionist origin story to cloak the country's true origins, which are settler colonial. Because invasion is a structure, not an event, everyone who comes to live in the United States, regardless of where they came from, is a settler responsible for continuing the dispossession and genocide that began in the 17th century. Calling these newcomers immigrants is merely an alibi, Dunbar-Ortiz insists. The desire to relieve the non-European migrant or descendants of enslaved Africans from responsibility is understandable but not sustainable if the settler colonial foundation is to be eradicated. Of course, as I said, if the settler, going back to his orchestra metaphor, if the settler colonial foundation is to be eradicated, then everybody who is not an indigenous American must be exterminated. That is what Kirsch is saying is settler colonialism theory. By insisting that American institutions and the American way of life are the responsibility of settlers, not immigrants, Dunbar-Ortiz takes a progressive route to the same conclusion as some nativist thinkers. A quarter century ago, the political scientist Samuel Huntington also attacked the idea that America is a nation of immigrants and also insisted that American identity and institutions were the work of white Anglo-Saxon settlers. But where Dunbar-Ortiz believes that these institutions are so powerful that they turn subsequent immigrants into settlers, Huntington had the opposite fear, that multicultural immigration would erode the settler legacy, which he saw in positive terms. I should say, by the way, that I could not tolerate this book, and I found another book which covered some of the same ground by Ned Blackhawk, which I read and enjoyed very much, as opposed to this. Let me continue. In a 2000 lecture, Huntington posited that from the earliest time, American identity has been defined in terms of the Anglo-Protestant culture, values, and institutions of the founding settlers, including individualism, liberty, the work ethic, the rule of law, private property, and hostility to concentrated power. Until the late 20th, it's interesting that we're talking about American identity, just as this book is talking about identity. Until the late 20th century, he argued, immigrants to the United States who were neither Anglo nor Protestant felt a strong pressure to assimilate to this culture. But the advent of multiculturalism, combined with a steep increase in immigration from Mexico, threatened to erode the Anglo-Protestant matrix of American success. Mexican immigration, Huntington concluded, is a unique, disturbing, and looming challenge to our cultural integrity, our national identity, and potentially to our future as a country. Huntington's distrust of immigrants and Dunbar-Ortiz's distrust of settlers end up converging from opposite directions, not unlike the way religious Zionists and anti-Zionists converge in their views of Israel's occupied territories. It's a familiar ideological phenomenon. The right and the left have often united in disparaging the compromises of liberalism, which they see as weakly evasive. And it's no accident that the ideology of settler colonialism is flourishing today at the same time as right-wing populism. Both see our turbulent political moment as an opportunity to permanently change the way Americans think about their country. So, again, I can't deal and I can't pursue this book to the end with the argument about ideology, the ideology called settler colonialism. As I've said, for me, the phrase is useful, definitely useful. But whether that means I subscribe to every line of some treatise by some scholar who perhaps first invented the term, I cannot say. Probably not, if, as Kirsch says, it requires the extermination of everybody who is not indigenous American. But I think that whatever this obsession is with American identity, as he says, an identity which did not include the African American perspective at all. Whatever identity some pundit, some scholar, some politician, some president of the United States even invents for ourselves in a finely wrought phrase is not ultimately going to create a sense of self-identity for people. As I said in my video yesterday, I think it was, talking about Bridgeport, how the constituency of the Bridgeport neighborhood is changing. Every neighborhood is in flux all the time. Guess what? The constituency of this country is changing all the time. You are not going to change the fact of what has happened in the past. As Moses Finley wrote, the world will have to be changed, not the past. As a writer of poetry, of course, the last thing on my mind is self-identity. Writing of poetry, and I would suggest, although I don't know because I'm not an authority on art, but I would suggest that along the lines of T.S. Eliot's statement about personality, that the function of art is an escape from identity. I know in my own experience with channeling the muse, if you will, personal identity has not been a factor. If the traditional view of American history was triumphalist and exclusionary, and the liberal view is complacent and dishonest, the ideology of settler colonialism offers a new way of telling the American story as an unmitigated disaster. Again, we're talking about small little subsets of scholars who are using these terms, and they certainly influence the debate, but what this country comes to be will not be dependent upon them. So that is probably enough. It just really annoys me that I found that typo in here. Where was that typo? And oh well, I think I showed it to you already. I don't need to show it again. But it bothers me to see a typo like that. I mean, it just in like the very first couple of pages. As I say, it leads me to believe it may have been a rush job. So I did not talk about an indigenous people's history of the United States, though Kirsch makes mention of a book by this historian. And I also mentioned this book just as something which I don't know, whereas Kirsch's book is a little bit too slim, this might be a little too fat for me. And then this book, which I found in the neighborhood box, which I'm going to put back. So, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, Palestine Hijacked, on Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice, an odd grouping of words. I think put there with an eye to the marketplace and finally, an Indigenous Histories People of the United States. So I will do a pile up for you. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.